something new. It was not, I knew early on that I was not going to own property and build a wood kiln and have that be something that I could maintain myself. So I wanted to learn something that was more practical to the life that I was most likely going to sort of have. So this photo here is sort of the inspiration for the current body of work I'm making. This sort of has been a long journey to this body of work, but this was sort of the inspiration photo, that idea of a sort of rich red color with industrial colors coming through. There's an oil drum. And I also take a lot of pictures. I mentioned to one of the girls earlier, since the first year I had my iPhone, I took almost 10,000 pictures. So those pictures to me, it's just usually random stuff, and dangerous pictures too when I'm driving. I sort of take the pictures of objects I see and want to remember and catalog in my brain. But I kind of wanted to figure out how to capture this kind of surface. So I don't know if you guys can see it very well, but this is like red tile with paint splatter with broken glass over top. And the idea of how much information is captured in that very shallow surface is very much like trying to get content onto ceramic objects, right? There's a very shallow surface in which to communicate anything. And so these are things that I kind of looked at in addition to architecture and landscape, and how to try to figure out how to put that stuff onto my pots. Another one of my favorite images of a shallow surface with a lot of content. So I sort of started in a place where, I'd seen my professor's work. I started drawing on pots. Drawing wasn't sort of my comfort zone, but I thought I may as well start someplace. And so I was layering slibs and playing with red clay and electric firing, and trying to really sort of uncover what exactly was the information I wanted to share. Started hand building. Previously, I'd sort of mostly been working on the wheel. Started coil building pots and layering slibs and content. I mentioned earlier to someone that wheelbarrows are one of my favorite objects in the world, just because they have this sort of discarded quality to them, but they have a very long life in a family, right? So if you own a wheelbarrow, you're usually using it for something and battering it to hell and repairing it with nails and doing weird stuff. They tend to linger and have a long life, and they're used until they're completely destroyed. And I kind of love that quality in an object. There's a lot of memory imbued in that, and a lot of beauty in that. I also love this picture too. I went to Spain, and these two buildings were across from each other in a plaza, and they sort of represent to me my journey in clay. Clay has a very long history, especially functional objects in our culture and in the world, basically. There's a long tradition, a long history, but we also, I live in 2015, and that idea of how do I make pots in a time when there's really no necessary need for them, right? You can go to Target and buy pots for cheap, or IKEA or whatever. But there's an importance to sort of carrying on a tradition in addition to what I have to say about what it means to live now and what I find of value now. So that's sort of, this is what that picture represents to me. I also randomly have a love of graffiti. But I think part of it is that idea of how much it incorporates into the environment in which it is being placed. And there's a lot of really talented people making some amazing stuff. Just a couple of pictures. So this is a hedge too. I like to point that out because you can walk through that little archway. But this was my grad work. So at the end of 3 years, this is sort of what I came up with for my thesis show. And I like to put a lot of these pictures in so you guys can sort of see the journey from undergrad to, this is basically probably 7 years of working seriously in clay, from that very first sort of keyhole to this. Figuring out how to learn to make objects and make them well, and then figure out how to have a voice in it and how to come up with a concept and then translate that concept into an actual object. It's a long and laborious journey. So be patient, I think, with yourself is what I'm trying to say. These are big, pineapple fruit holders. They're basically these giant objects. My last semester of grad school, I went through about 4,000 pounds of clay making these objects. So after grad school, I sort of recovered for a little while. I took six months off in house set in Portland, and then I started doing some residencies. And so a residency program in clay, often you travel to. They're sort of scattered all over the United States. My first one was in Sonoma, California. very strange place to live. I lived in an old school, basically where the part of the movie Scream was filmed in. It was like an old principal's office. And I made pots, my cats lived there with me. But I kind of, the cool thing about residencies is you sort of propose a project. You sort of have a very narrow window of time to make work, but then have a show. And so I basically wanted to get away from making all that giant stuff and back to making pots and sort of scaling back down. And I started someplace familiar to me, layering slips. But the nice thing, I was in Sonoma in the springtime, and I figured out that I tend to react sort of to what's happening in the world. So if it's springtime, I start to make vases. If it's fall, I start to make casserole dishes. There's that sort of correlation between those things, like for me. And so luckily, one of my students ended up being a florist, and so I taught while I was there too. And she ended up taking me to the San Francisco flower market, which was like one of those bucket list items, like get up at 3 in the morning and drive down there and pick up flowers. But it was kind of this wonderful idea that sort of struck me that, I make objects and I kind of see them completed, and completed being mean that they're full of food or full of flowers or they're being used someplace. And so there's this wonderful moment where I got to go, basically she sort of was like, calm down, you're going crazy, because I just kept buying all these really wild flowers, because that's how I sort of saw them in my pots. Like, when I make this box and put these holes in it, this is what I see coming out of it. And so it was really a sort of pivotal moment for me to start taking pictures with my work completed in my mind. And also that idea of like how nature and other things can really impact my work. So this was sort of the very beginning of the current body of work that I'm in now. Pots in action, we like to call these. But also I love it's also with the social media world now, and my pots being out in the world, people send me pictures of the pots that they use. They have of mine, and they use them in very different ways, and it's really kind of a lovely thing to sort of see, and continues that sort of, it sort of builds a strange, intimate relationship where they invite you into their homes and they send you pictures of them in their home, and so it's kind of this really interesting thing. Oh, I break for goats also, sorry. I love goats, I think they're really kind of interesting creatures, and so my friends take this picture, I'm sorry. Anyway, so I did a second residency. I did a short-term summer residency at Bray, and then I went back for a 2-year long-term residency. And this residency is a pretty prestigious residency in the ceramic community. It's a year-long residency. You can stay for a maximum of 2 years. They have 10 long-term residents and 10 summer residents, so it's a highly competitive residency. Usually over about 200 people apply every year for about 5 spots. So it sort of changes over slowly. But the great thing about this was in between my summer residency and my long-term residency, I was working adjunct, and I had a very difficult time trying to figure out how to survive teaching adjunct and having a career in the arts, making work, and trying to sort of further my career in the world. And I was working on building websites and trying to get my name out in the world, applying to shows and getting my work into galleries. And I just was struggling tremendously and wasn't quite sure I was going to make it. So when I went to the Bray the second time, my goal was to figure out if I could make a career being an artist. And so I really spent the 2 years there really figuring out social media stuff and how much it cost to ship stuff, what was the reality of the most cost-effective way for me to make work. I tend to work in series, and so I have a period of making where I'll fill up a kiln, fire that bisque kiln, then I'm glazing work, and then I'm sandblasting work. So this sort of period of time really gave me an idea of what exactly I needed to have a functioning studio, in addition to the sort of community that I like to be surrounded with. I am not someone that likes to be in my basement working all alone. I like to be surrounded by people and have that kind of feedback and interaction. After about 6 hours alone in the studio, I'm done. Either the TV comes on or I have to visit with somebody. So it's kind of a moment that I've realized that I really need to have a space in which other people are working. Another great thing about residencies is you have a lot of opportunities to make work and play and install work, have shows. One of the weird things too about residencies, often they're in the middle of nowhere. So the only community you have are the people that are there with you. Luckily, potters are really good cooks, so we tended to have pretty good food, because it was the only good food in Helena, Montana, I'm going to tell you right now. So, but we also, get to have lots of sales. This is more pictures of work in action. So this sort of next little bit of pictures is sort of a compilation of my work and images that inspire me. So I don't tend to print out any of the images that I take, but I do tend to catalog them. When I put together slideshows, I have to see this weird correlation between the work that I'm making and the pictures that I'm taking. And so I like to sort of share that because I do believe in sort of figuring out what your inspiration is and honoring that. Lots of pots. So this work, for those of you that don't know or haven't had any contact with my work, I use sort of a red clay body, which actually isn't earthenware anymore. It's sort of a mid-range red stoneware sort of base. And then I use sort of very bright colored clay, bright colored glazes. I'm really inspired by color and the way that it sort of evokes emotion from people and sort of creates a sense of nostalgia. A lot of the work that I make, people will often tell me stories about these colors in their childhood or objects in their life that were this color that my love reminds them of. But also, so my work is also actually sandblasted. So the outside, as much as they're shiny on the inside, they're matte on the outside. And that's exactly the same glaze. So I go through a very laborious process of sandblasting and then hand sanding pots. But there's something about that idea of I want them to visually look as soft as they actually are. Because there's something very much about that handheld object that I'm very interested in. And that idea of it being as like, this sort of reminds me of that wheelbarrow, that idea of sort of, they're like kind of acid wash jeans, right? They're sort of